Do you ever have a great pairing like chicken nuggets and mashed potatoes?
Or crab claws and corn on the cob?
And it just makes each part taste different, maybe even better than they would on their own? This is Juxtapose, the podcast where we...
Sorry.
I got a case of the giggles, oh my god. This is Juxtapose, the podcast where we bring you two tasty pieces of art to see what they're like together.
I'm your host, Bea Forkin.
And I'm Sarah Peacher. Let's dig in.
Okay. All right. So today I'm bringing to the table Flo Milli. Flo Milli is a young contemporary rapper. She's really known for her fun and confident lyrics and music. She is from Mobile, Alabama. Her birth name is Tamia Monique Carter. And she really rose to prominence after 2018 with the song Beef Flow Mix. And then its 2019 follow-up In the Party. It reached viral status on social media platforms like TikTok, and then she received a respective gold certification by the Recording Industry Association of America. Then in late 2019, she signed a recording contract with Justin Goldman's 94 Sounds and RCA Records. Both songs would become issued as lead singles for Carter's debut mixtape, Ho, Why Is You Here?, which was released to critical acclaim and marked her first entry at number 76 on the Billboard 200. Also receiving placement on Rolling Stone's 200 Greatest Hip-Hop Albums of All Time list in 2022. She was nominated for Best New Artist at the 2020 BET Hip Hop Awards. In July 2022, she released her debut album, You Still Hear Ho, which saw similar critical reception despite failing to chart worldwide. I'm going to share a couple of quotes that I feel are a good description of who she is as an artist and her music. So this is a quote from Dazed Digital of an interview that they conducted with Flo Milli. Quote, "This is music designed to get people out of their shells." Flo Milli clarifies, "These are songs that will make you look in the mirror and want to go even harder." This is another quote taken from when they published an album review. Quote, "When she claims, 'None of you bitches is fucking with me,' it feels less like a boast and more like a law that governs the universe. There's no moment on her debut mixtape, Ho, Why Is You Here?, where she doesn't sound untouchable and self-possessed. The brief, playful project from the Alabama rapper is one of the breeziest records of the year. A clinic on nimble shit-talking that's as effortless as it is brash." I really like that description, and I feel like that ties into like my personal connection with her music. So what I love about her is just her larger-than-life confidence, such a fun, colorful sense of fashion, her refusal to be anything other than herself. And when I was preparing for this episode, I just loved how she would describe herself in interviews. Like she would just refer to herself as saying that she's always had star quality. She always knew she was going to be a star. And for some reason, like in that Pitchfork album review, it like doesn't feel like off-putting for me. Like it's just like, yeah, you are a star. I like believe whatever it is she's saying. And it's refreshing to hear and see a young woman just owning herself and being really unapologetic about it.
Do you have a favorite song or like of the albums that she's released so far? What do you love the most?
I know that this is just like an intro to the album, but I feel like it's a great intro to the album because it introduces you to her whole sound and her whole ethos of what she's all about. Let me tell you the name of it. It is from, pretty sure, her first album, Mood Every Day. I don't even think it's like a minute long, but basically she says, like, bitch, I'm better than you. When I shine, but when you shine, you get a whole lot of hate. Again, those phrases I feel like would be so off-putting to hear somebody say, like, I'm better than you. Like, what a arrogant thing to say. But for some reason, it like really works for her in a way that doesn't feel off-putting. And it doesn't feel like she's really saying that she's better than other people, even though she like literally says it. There's something really playful about the delivery of it that just feels like, she's just having fun. Like she's just trying to fit into this genre of music, of hip hop, where a lot of hip hop music is about being really braggadocious or larger than life. And so it really works.
Today, I'm bringing to the table the dark comedy TV series Search Party, which ran from 2016 to 2022. And I watched, I think, after it was complete, once it was over. So I got to watch all the seasons at once, and I really sped through them. But here's a little plot synopsis. So the show follows four self-absorbed, to say the least, 20-somethings who become entangled in an ominous mystery when a former college acquaintance suddenly disappears. They also end up embroiled in a crime as part of their attempt to find this missing college acquaintance, and that crime forces all of them to keep silent, and it really deeply affects and tests the trust between them. Over the course of 5 seasons, the show becomes increasingly absurd, but from the get-go, I felt attached to these insane, often horrible, yet somehow care-forable characters. I felt too attached to stop watching, and it was worth it with the places that the writers end up taking the show. So to speak more about the writers here, the show creators are Sarah Violet Bliss, Charles Rogers, and Michael Showalter. Sarah Violet Bliss and Charles Rogers are a filmmaking team that met at NYU in the graduate film program, which they sort of weave into how the show begins with these 4 friends who were friends in college, and they start to come together and bond over this search party experience that they're having. And I feel that they really draw from their own experience to craft these characters in the scenarios that happen, even though it's at a much more absurdist scale and level. One note about these folks, and I don't want this to be too much of a tangent, but I do want to address it. Showrunner Charles Rogers was accused of alleged sexual assault earlier this year. There was a previous investigation which resulted in the production assistant who was making the accusation recanting his claim. It was complicated, messy. There's still a lot up in the air around this. But I wanted to bring this up because when we discover something like this has happened with someone who has created something that we enjoy, they've done a bad thing, we've got to acknowledge that. And I want to emphasize that 2 things can be true at once. I enjoyed the show. I thought it was funny. And one of the creators hurt someone, and I would never condone that. This circumstance really speaks to how the writers may have been able to generate these characters who can be pretty awful to one another. In a way, it's campy. There's, it's exaggerating real life, but there's also something true there, and we have to acknowledge that. And this situation being brought to light underscores some of the themes of the show, which explores people facing the consequences of their actions that hurt other people. Anything you want to add to that, B?
I really like this sentence that you put here about the show exploring people facing the consequences of their actions, and I appreciate you acknowledging the harm done by one of the creators, because I feel like one of the toughest things about being in the world is how few consequences there can be for some people who do harmful things. So I appreciate you saying that. That's all.
Absolutely. with that in mind, I'm going to continue talking about this show. I started watching mostly because of Aaliyah Shawkat, who plays the lead character, Dory. Many people may know her from Arrested Development, where she played Maybe, which, side note, I wrote here that I think it's a cool name. But also, I have not seen a ton of Arrested Development. I think it was a bit too cringy of a show for me. I've seen some episodes, like the banana stand one, predominantly. But aside from that, I just knew who Aaliyah Shawkat was, and that recognition of her face really drew me in to want to watch the show. Dory is a really interesting character to me because, similarly to one or both of the characters we talked about last episode, there's a blurry line between her being a predator or accomplice of crimes and being a victim. Small spoiler here, she ends up very much being both at different points of the show. And she's not the only character where this is the case. All four of the main characters, the main crew who are friends, are very questionable and lovable at the same time. I also connect with Dory as a character because she's on this search for herself or for a calling for her life. And this is something that Aaliyah Shawkat talked about in an interview with NPR. At the same time, she and other characters can be really unlikable, but what rings true is that they're searching for something. Changes every season, but so off the top of my head, some of the most memorable episodes definitely have to do with the group's involvement in a cult, actually more than one cult. Also the finale of the first season, and there's also an episode where there's a bunch of different Dorys that come together in the episode, which is really interesting. All of season 5 is also just kind of crazy. Jeff Goldblum is in a few episodes in season 5. There are also zombies. So the whole show is very ridiculous. It goes some ridiculous places, but I'm going to expound on that season 4 finale, episode 10 of season 4. So there's multiple Dorys that come together in this episode. Basically, the way that it starts is that Dory, spoiler alert, dies or appears to die an episode or two before the finale. In the finale, she's attending her own memorial service. So there's actually several of herselves from the different seasons attend the service, appearing from most recent to furthest in the past. It's showing that she's having this epiphany about herself while being dead, where many of the things in the previous season sort of come together to help her start to understand things about herself. Elliot Goss, which is one of the friends, one of the other characters, gives a whole speech about how we are all unlikable, and it's kind of like cathartic at first, but then he looks directly at the camera saying, quote, "If you have complicated feelings still in you about your love for Dory, just remember there's a dark side in all of us, but that darkness is connected to the light, people," end quote. And then he kind of goes on a wild nationalist tirade after that. But, you know, in many ways, comedy is exaggerating the truth of the matter. And I think that that quote really spoke to me as a viewer of why am I connected to Dory? Why do I feel a sense of I care about this character when clearly she is horrible. General vibes and themes of this show that I wanted to point out as we're thinking about the ways that these two pieces overlap is sort of the extreme of what could happen in every scenario does. There's sort of this coming of age narrative. There's a mash of genres, like a lot of different genres collide in this show, and the characters don't necessarily evolve or get better. That might be a difference from Flo Milli that we might spot here, but they repeat a lot of the same mistakes just in new ways, quote the same story told on a different scale as talked about in a cut interview with the cast. In that NPR interview that I mentioned before, also, Aaliyah says, quote, "And as the seasons have gone on, it's gotten more extreme and more intense and more kind of graphically crazy. And I feel like that's what the world has felt like over the last, 5 years.
So true.
Things have just gotten more surreal. And I think good art does a really great job of mirroring that feeling of not knowing what's happening." End quote. And I liked that quote, and I pulled that quote because I think that is another way in which I felt like the show was speaking to things that I was feeling about what was going on around me, the surrealism and the not knowing what's happening or what will happen next. Okay, so one of the articles that you were looking at for this episode talked about how Flo Milli's style is a continuation of Missy Elliott's. As a Missy Elliott fan yourself, do you agree? And in what ways do you see Flo Milli's rap in conversation with those before her, especially Missy?
I do agree. I think what they both have in common and what I think has allowed Missy Elliott's career to sustain, like basically like icon status, which I feel like she has now, is just that authenticity. That is something that just sustains across every decade, every generation. And I think it's actually something that's like really rare, which I think makes it really special when you find it. So I feel like beyond the authenticity between them, they also just bring so much fun. Like there's so much fun to the music. You just want to get up and dance. You want to sing along to it. And sense of style. That was something I always really admired about Missy Elliott, was that she just, again, it's like a continuation of her music, just such fun fashion. And you see that in Flo Milli's fashion too, a lot of color, very playful. At the time when Missy Elliott was making music, she was also like really sensual in her music, like really, I guess, bold in her lyrics. And I feel like Flo Milli really takes that like, 10 notches further, which is really refreshing, because when Missy Elliott was making songs like Can You Work It, that was like really risque then, and like no other like mainstream female artist was making music like that. So when she was doing it, it was like, what? She kind of like opened that door, and then Milli and a lot of other contemporary rappers like burst it wide open. What about you? Are you a fan of Missy Elliott? How can you not be? But you can tell me if you're not.
I mean, I've listened to some of her music and it's really enjoyable. Definitely like, and the fact that she's made stuff recently that is still like she's on top of her game and she knows what audiences will want is pretty incredible. And like you said, I feel like their flows and the way that they use their voices to communicate things in their songs are similar in some ways, and maybe that's also where they're in conversation, is their style of rap a bit too. Yes.
Part of rap music and hip hop music is that larger than life persona, and something that male artists have been criticized for is misogyny in their lyrics, like objectifying women and whatnot. And then you see that first, you saw that with Missy Elliott with her objectifying men, not really, but like just being really larger than life with like a sexual persona too. And I feel like that is very prominent with Flo Milli's lyrics. Like basically, if you're not going to treat me right, I'm going to just like, I'm going to discard you, which in real life, like, wow, that's like a really horrible way to treat somebody. But it's like, I don't know, it just like works in the songs. I don't know how to describe why it works, but
I feel like ultimately we talk about in poetry and other forms of writing too, of like putting on a persona in order to write something. And I feel like Flo Milli does that, and a lot of rappers do put on a persona, and some even have like multiple personas that they lean into, even just in one song. And they'll use those multiple voices or like modes of speaking in order to emphasize what they're trying to say in different ways. So I feel like that's what Flo Milli is doing.
It feels like almost like hyper aware of its performance of that, or it's hyper aware of its persona.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so that awareness is what makes it feel authentic and permissible, accepted. Okay. So I know you talked a lot about Dory and your connection to her.
Yeah, I'll talk more about Dory here. We were discussing a little bit beforehand, but a couple friends of mine had me retake the Myers Briggs test recently because I hadn't in a while. I think I'm still the same thing as I was when I was younger. Maybe the last time I took it was in college or something. But when I took it this time, I got INFJ, which I think is called like the advocate or something like that. But that personality type is supposed to be like really known for advocating for causes, whether that's good or bad. And I feel like I don't know Dory's character's like Myers Briggs or like what her official like label would be, but from what I can see of her, she does want to advocate for what is right and she wants to do something good with her life, and that I identify with. I think a lot of people would identify with is that we want to attempt to be helpful in some way. We want to find a cause that we can stand for. But the flip side of that is that she is a good leader amongst her friends, but that gets exaggerated to the point where she becomes a cult leader and they are members of her cult that she starts. So, which is crazy. But I, when I was reading the description for the Myers Briggs thing, it did sort of talk about like people who are this personality can be good leaders or whatever. I got told that a lot when I was growing up too, and I was always like, I don't want that though. Like, let me just like be in the corner and not have to do things in order to lead other people or whatever. But also, it makes me aware of the fact that like I have to be careful with any ability that I do have to like start things or like organize things. Like, I have to make sure that I'm organizing for good. Otherwise, I will become a Dory who starts a cult and like, you know, goes off the deep end in that sense. So it's weird, but I think that the show showed me something about myself that was important to know. Like, I'm not necessarily above, like most people, I'm not necessarily above, not abusing power. I don't know how to say this without making it sound like.
No, I mean, I feel like that we're not immune to kind of crossing the line at times or
Yes. And
our
we
values
should
getting
be,
distorted.
yeah, we should be self aware enough to sense when we're going down that kind of path.
Or have really good friends that can point out our blind spots.
True. Yes.
I wanted to say something about that. I feel like the first episode does a really good job of introducing that theme. I'm thinking of that scene in the apartment with Dory and her boyfriend when they are brushing their teeth together and they overhear like sounds like a domestic violence situation happening above them, and Dory immediately wants to do something. She like wants to intervene. She's like, "Oh my god, like we have to do something." And then her boyfriend's like, "No, just, just ignore it, just like forget about it. But if we hear glass shatter, then we'll go intervene." And like,
Hmm.
2 beats later, glass shatters. And then I guess he agrees to go like intervene on it. And I love that scene because I feel like it's so adequately captured that like savior syndrome and
Mm.
how it can be like misplaced. So he like goes, he knocks on the door and he's like, "So if there's anything going on, like we have a safe space for you upstairs." And like she just like launches at him and she's like screaming at him, like saying all these names. Like it's like an awful scene, but I feel like it captures that desire to help, stepping into this place of being condescending or patronizing in some way, or you bring your own narrative to it and you're met with a different narrative, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And that dynamic between Dory and her boyfriend continues throughout the entire series. So I think it's really interesting that you point out that first little scene where we get a glimpse of it, and it's very closely related to life there, like real life there, of
Mm-hmm.
like that. I could imagine that happening on a regular day. You hear something and you want to go say something,
Of
but that
course.
dynamic gets it continues, perpetuates, but it spirals to a whole another level where Dorothy is a cult leader and she gets her friends to do all her bidding.
Oh my God. I can't even imagine.
From what I was seeing, Flo Milli talks a bit about how she got to this sort of hyper confidence that she displays in her music. Do you see any parallels between her and some of the development of the characters in Search Party, or are they and she pretty different in terms of personal development?
So I've read some interviews with Flo Milli where this question comes up a lot, like, how did you get to be so confident? And she talks a lot about growing up in Mobile, Alabama, and having just such a loving family. They really provided her with a great structure where she could, I guess, develop that like positive self esteem. However, the community that she grew up in, like, was not the most supportive. She talks a lot about experiencing racism in Alabama. And this is something that I learned from my reading interviews with her, that Alabama was like one of the very last states to let go of slavery. I did not know that. So she talks about that in interviews. And so, but she just like credits her family for just being such a supportive place for her to explore who she was and to develop who she was. The huge difference between these characters is that, how I see it, I feel like the characters in Search Party so much desire what I would imagine they see Flo Milli exuding, like a sense of who she is, a sense of purpose, an authenticity in that, and kind of like that unwavering belief in her own voice, her unwavering belief in like just who she is as a person and like what she stands for. And like she's very clear about what she wants her music to do for people. Whereas in just like one episode of meeting all of the characters, I just saw them as just so deeply insecure and wanting to be seen as somebody, but not really knowing how to get there. And I feel like you had a really good point you made, that the show is really about like they're searching for who they are.
I totally agree that it's very clear that the search party in question at the beginning of the
Yes.
show is that they are literally looking for this girl, Chantel, who they knew from college. But as the series progresses, it's no longer about that search party. So then you start to question, okay, so like what are they searching for? It becomes very evident over time that they continue to search for themselves and they're looking for, like you said, a sense of purpose,
Mm-hmm.
their place in the world. They're mid 20 somethings. So I feel like that is very common for people at that age to be trying to figure out what they're meant to do. For some, apparently, it's become cult leaders or join a right wing talk show. For
Oh my
others,
God.
it's become a really great rapper like Flo Milli.
Yes.
And then one huge difference that I think is important to point out is that Flo Milli, the rapper, like that persona, is a lot closer to the real person, to Mia Monique Carter. Her real experience really informs her work. And that's true probably of the writing for Search Party, but the characters in Search Party are not real people. So it can be scary though when the things that they do are things that real people would do and it's not as
Mm-hmm.
hyperbolic. but there is a lot of like hyperbole in the things that they do, which is different from Flo Milli. I think that confidence that she has is really there. Whereas the characters in Search Party, they make up their confidence constantly and they are putting on a persona that is nowhere close to who they actually are, who they could be, you know?
That reminds me of like the opening scene when they were like all sitting together at brunch and their Dory's informing them all about Chantel being missing. And then one of the guys was like, she sucks. Like she was horrible. And like he doesn't know anything about her. And then like 2 beats go by. And then you see him like opening up his phone and he's like posting something to social media about how devastated he is. Oh my God. I love that so much. And like, while I was watching the entire show, I kept thinking about The Nanny and how that was all about like performance and like being seen as something, wanting to craft a persona that can convince other people that you're a certain way and like using all these different means to do it, like social media for one. But what I really feel like makes Flo Milli so successful is the things that you said, that Flo Milli, the character, is derived from something deeply personal, is also so authentic that you can't fake it, you know? Like you can see through that lack of authenticity in others.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you kind of just talked about it, but do you want to say a little bit more about where the show goes? If there's anything more to say about that? Like with that central theme of like search for self, like do the characters ever fully find who they are by the end of the season or the end of the series?
I think it's kind of open-ended, honestly. Their search for themselves is ongoing. I think that's something important that you have to realize as a young person, is that you are going to continue to change and discover new things about yourself for the entirety of your life. But what stays the same is the pattern of the relationships amongst the characters. So the way that, you know, Dorothy is sort of the leader of the friend group, or like the one who incites things. And then the ways in which like her boyfriend is her sort of like sidekick, and then the other two friends are along for the ride. Those same patterns of the relationship, they rediscover them every season, and by the end of the show too, they're like, this is just the relationship that we have created amongst ourselves, and that will remain consistent no matter what happens around us, such as a zombie apocalypse. So like we see them at the very end of the show just showing up to like a party in the zombie apocalypse, and they're like getting entry at the door, and it just feels very similar to like they're just still doing the same stuff that they did as like young Brooklynites back in the day. So some things change around them, but they're always going to have the same sort of behaviors and patterns of behavior, which is sad in some ways, that they don't grow a better relationship dynamic. But in other ways, is their relationship dynamic just the one that is going to be the dynamic because of who they are as people at their very core. Something else about this pairing that I think a lot about, that I think is like kind of an overlap, is ego and the display of self-confidence. We've talked a little bit about sort of like artifice versus authenticity. Where do you think the line is drawn between being self-centered versus self-confident, as potentially shown by this pairing in particular?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And it's something that I've reflected on a lot. And it kind of ties into this other thing that I've been thinking about, which is this phrase that like we hear all the time, like in the working world, which is like cultivating like a personal brand. And at first it sounds like a cringy, like corporate speak. But as I've researched more, I've discovered that it's not something that's an artifice. It's like something that is born from that authenticity. It's knowing who you are and then finding ways to communicate that in a way that is tied to the kind of work that you do. So it's not something that's manipulated. It's not something that's artificially created to like leverage yourself like into the world. So there is a difference how Flo Milli projects herself and her fun, like playful music and this persona. In her music, it lands really well. But in interviews, Flo Milli as a person is confident and also just extremely grateful that she gets to share her artistry and her message. I think, too, what makes self-confidence different from self-centeredness is being fully grounded in knowing who you are. Self-centeredness, I think, comes from deep insecurity, kind of like attention seeking, kind of believing that if like you have enough attention in the world, like that will somehow like fill you up. And I think it demonstrates a lack of self-awareness and a lack of awareness for others. I think it all boils down to being, like, as cheesy as it is, but I feel like it's something that we're all searching for, is knowing who we are and like how can I share who I am with others. And then self-centeredness is being stuck in the self and approaching life from what you can get from people in some way versus how you can benefit the world in a helpful, inspiring way.
True. Yes. I think looking at Search Party, you see the self-centeredness in the very fact that Dorothy, when she's trying to be this savior and find Chantel and stuff, she does it because she wants that attention for herself and she wants to be the good person, TM.
Exactly.
So, yeah. And then Flo Milli, it's about her artistry and sharing her music with people and in a way sharing herself with people. And it's bits and pieces, it's snippets, but it's coming through in the music of that's her real self being transmuted into the thing that she creates.
I was going to say something about social media and like influencer culture and how it can be like what you're saying, like a version of the characters in Search Party where it's like all artifice, all look at me being me, versus like here I am, listen to my message and how it can help.
I feel like that's an interesting parallel to draw between Flo Milli and Search Party also is the role of social media, the role that social media plays in both of these. Flo Milli, she's been doing her thing for a while and she just happened to pop off on TikTok because she made a good song. Whereas the characters in Search Party, they keep doing stuff in order to get people's attention and then they're posting on social media. They even go live at one point. I think it's when Dory is leading their cult that she does stuff on social media in order to gain a following and literally a cult following. So social media plays very different roles for both of these situations, but these are some of the earliest stories that we have as a society starting to speak to the artifice of social media and the ways that we use social media in order to either be authentic or to put out a persona version of ourselves that is like very different from who we actually are in reality.
I feel like social media is like a tool where it can either really highlight our like societal blemishes like narcissism, artifice, hyper individuality, or it can be a tool for good. So, and I feel like Search Party just does such a great job of highlighting that.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for listening to today's episode about Search Party and Flo Milli. Please check out our website at the link in the description for more information about this episode. If you have any feedback or a pairing that you're just dying for us to talk about, send us a quick message over there on our website and we'll see what we can do about it. We'll be back again in a couple weeks with an episode about the Challengers movie and Baby Mother. Bye!